O God, I ask for your guidance today to give us clarity to help the people we serve to the very best of our ability. I ask that you help us maintain our resolve no matter what obstacles we may face. I also ask that you keep our wits sharp and that we always keep our loved ones in mind while we do our work, with every keystroke, pen stroke, with every word. Amen.
Amen.
Good morning, members. As you know, today is day last, so have a good day today. Minister statements. Minister responsible for industry, tourism, and investment.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, the COVID-19 global pandemic has impacted every aspect of life in our territory. The Government of the Northwest Territories has responded to the pandemic in a variety of ways. In addition to the measures taken to protect the health and safety of our residents and communities, our government has acted to mitigate the economic impacts of this crisis on our economy and to invest in the economic well-being of Northwest Territories industry and businesses. Mr. Speaker, we knew that for our economy to recover, we would need our mines and supporting industries to be operating, small businesses to be open, and our people to be working. That being said, our first priority was to address the health and safety of entrepreneurs, business owners, and their employees. Following that, we acted to ensure the Northwest Territories communities and residents would continue to receive critical supplies. With so many remote and dispersed communities, we are acutely aware of the importance of the supply chain, perhaps more so than our southern counterparts. Since these initial first steps, Mr. Speaker, the Departments of Infrastructure and Industry, Tourism and Investment have rolled out a sequence of measured and organized steps in tandem with the federal government to ensure funding reliefs are available. Some of these reliefs include waiving fees impacting truckers and air carriers to provide nearly $2.5 million in economic relief. We have also continued to advocate regularly to the federal government on behalf of Northern Airlines facing unprecedented operating challenges due to the pandemic. Capital loans have also been made available through the Business Development and Investment Corporation to businesses that needed immediate liquidity. Mr. Speaker, since March 20th, the N.W.T has committed over $20 million in offsets and supports for Northwest Territories businesses. Collectively, our territory, its governments, business chambers, and stakeholder organizations have been able to deliver the message in Ottawa that we need specific and regionally appropriate support programs for our businesses. As a supplement to Canada's national business relief plans, Cannor's Northern Business Relief Fund significantly expanded relief options for Northwest Territories and Indigenous businesses. On May 8th, the Minister of Finance announced $8.7 million for Northwest Territories Airlines, the first of two phases of federal funding to help maintain the critical links that they provide. On May 12th, with support from the federal government, the N.W.T then announced a $6.2 million plan to top up wages for workers making less than $18 per hour. Through all of this, Mr. Speaker, we have also worked with our mines and resource companies to ensure their safe and continued operation. We have taken steps to protect mineral tenure in the Northwest Territories by suspending payment and work requirements until the end of June, and we'll be extending that relief for an additional 90 days. We'll need our resource sector to anchor our recovery. Mining and exploration are the biggest source of private sector jobs and income for our residents. And as we get back to business, we'll be a major buyer of products and services from the Northwest Territories. The Mining Incentive Program has been adapted to support Northwest Territories prospectors and company-led mineral exploration projects, and to ensure that their projects this summer will be in line with orders and conditions of the Chief Public Health Officer. Mr. Speaker, much has been said about the need for economic stimulus and recovery, but it is only thanks to our investments and relief efforts that we are able to now look forward. As we do, an important component of economic stimulus and recovery will be investment in N.W.T infrastructure projects. Not only will these projects inject money into the economy, they will provide business and employment opportunities for our residents. In 2020-21, the N.W.T is planning to invest over $500 million in infrastructure throughout the Northwest Territories. This will allow us to deliver a total of 152 capital projects in 28 Northwest Territories communities, including schools, long-term care and healthcare facilities, and major transportation projects. Many of these projects are multi-year projects that will begin or continue this year. This investment continues to leverage significant federal infrastructure dollars. Mr. Speaker, the N.W.T will continue to advocate and work with the federal government on infrastructure initiatives that lead to jobs, economic growth, and prosperity both in the Northwest Territories and Canada. Meanwhile, as Northwest Territories businesses begin to resume operations across the North, we have reintroduced our Support for Entrepreneurs and Economic Development Policy Program for the 2021 fiscal year. It represents $4 million of potential investments into projects in which community employment is emphasized and where the bulk of funding will be spent in our communities. Similarly, we will inject about $4.4 million into parks infrastructure, tourism product development, and community infrastructure projects this summer, supporting local suppliers, contractors, and employees as we improve our tourism product for the future. As we begin to emerge wisely from public health measures, Mr. Speaker, economic recovery will begin within our territory and will depend greatly on what we can do for each other. The importance of the Buy North or Shop N.W.T message has never been as true as it is today. Our recovery will also have to be in step with the needs and capacity of our business community. The new Business Advisory Council will be the voice of N.W.T business in my office. It will ensure that the experience, talent, and resources of the Northwest Territories private sector are considered in our decision-making. And as we look ahead, I believe the collective worldwide effort that will be put into economic recovery will bring new opportunities. If we can position ourselves to learn from the wave of innovation that I believe we will see, we can reimagine our own economy for the future, one that continues to promote our wealth of natural resources, but also encourages a more diversified and resilient economy that builds upon our natural strengths. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Thank you, Minister. Minister statements. Minister statements. Minister responsible for the Northwest Territories Housing Corporation.
Mr. Speaker, increasing the number of affordable homes and reducing a core housing need is a priority of this government. The difficult times that we are emerging from are highlighted. The safety and security of housing is at its highest need. The delivery of housing services became more challenging given our need to stay healthy in preparation of COVID-19. Through physical distancing, Mr. Speaker, I rise today to recognize the individuals and organizations involved to ensure safe housing and affordable shelters are available to our residents. Many of these people work behind the scenes, delivering critical services for housing, solutions, and emergency repairs. I am proud and grateful for the work being done by the Northwest Territories Housing Corporation and staff and all of our community partners, such as the local housing organizations and emergency shelter providers that help us to provide housing for homelessness and support the homelessness. These important frontline workers support approximately 2,800 units under the Northwest Territories Housing Corporation programming and 5 overnight shelters. The Indigenous government partners worked diligently with the Northwest Territories Housing Corporation when we faced the uncertainty of COVID-19. The impact that would impact their communities, the N.W.T government and Alitsokay Dene First Nation had no hesitation in offering to take on the administration of some of the public housing units for this purpose of self-isolation. While ultimately these units were not required to address COVID-19, these communities and their leaders demonstrated to their people that they were prepared to do what it takes to keep their residents safe. I want to also thank the private industry for their contributions during this time. Many landlords face their own economic pressures. In the community of Hay River, I want to thank the owners of North Country Inn, which was utilized to support some residents experiencing homelessness. Larger industries also wanted to help out. In Norman Wells, Imperial Oil Limited offered the use of their staff housing units should they be required. I want to recognize the work of the staff at the Northwest Territories Housing Corporation who successfully continue to deliver essential services such as emergency repairing program, rent support, and homelessness assistance fund. Mr. Speaker, I want to thank our partners in delivering the housing to the communities. I also want to express my gratitude for their commitment to housing our residents of the Northwest Territories and their professionalism during this time. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Thank you, Minister. Minister statements, minister statements, minister responsible for education, culture and employment.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, as the end of the 2019-2020 school year approaches, planning for how to safely reopen schools in the fall is well underway. The Department of Education, Culture and Employment is working diligently with its education partners to create a supportive and effective learning environment for students in the 2020-2021 school year and beyond. As we emerge wisely into more relaxed public health restrictions, I want to be clear, the upcoming school year will not be a return to normal. I understand that all of us want desperately to get back into our routines and have this crisis end. That cannot happen this fall, and the number one priority of my office and the Department of Education, Culture and Employment has to remain the health and safety of our students and education staff. Schools will be taking strong action to meet the recommendations of the Chief Public Health Officer while providing junior kindergarten to grade 12 education programs and services starting this fall, and we continue to need the support of all our residents to make this happen. Mr. Speaker, ECE and education bodies responsible for delivering education are working on a coordinated, system-wide approach for the coming school year that is based on the detailed criteria provided by the Office of the Chief Public Health Officer on how to safely reopen schools. This approach is focused on achieving the following priorities: maintaining the health and safety of students, staff, and communities, starting the school year on time, maximizing in-person learning as much as possible, seeking equity across regions, maintaining financial supports to schools and the programs they offer, and supporting continuity of learning. While details on specific health and safety measures will vary from school to school, Mr. Speaker, there are some general measures that will be enacted in schools across the N.W.T to help maintain physical distance. These include limits on class size, enhanced cleaning and disinfecting practices, strict hand washing routines, designated entrances and exits, staggered breaks, drop-offs and dismissals, use of personal protective equipment by staff and students when physical distance cannot be maintained, spacing of desks and other furniture, restricting and managing flow in hallways and common areas through floor markings and/or physical barriers, encouraging activities to take place outdoors when possible, restrictions on assemblies, choir and music classes, drama, team sports, and other gatherings where physical distancing is not possible, and limited access to schools for parents, guardians, and visitors. Education will be delivered based on factors such as school size and layout, grade level, the number of students and staff, access to technology, and the unique needs of each student. Individual schools will be making adjustments to student transportation, food programs, and scheduling in order to accommodate public health recommendations. In our smaller schools, it is likely that students will be safely accommodated within the existing space and will not need to rely as much on distance learning. However, larger schools with more staff and students will have a harder time delivering the full extent of education programming within the school space. In these situations, schools may access space outside of the school, provide a blended learning approach that will prioritize in-person learning, or continue to support at-home distance learning if necessary. Mr. Speaker, this is a dynamic situation, and plans for the coming school year may need to change as new information or public health and workplace safety requirements are identified. Public bodies are taking a flexible approach to their planning to account for a potential second wave of COVID-19 in the fall of 2020 to ensure schools are able to open and remain open. The Government of the Northwest Territories is committed to providing regular updates to the public as plans move forward for the upcoming school year. Each school will need to have its reopening plan assessed and approved by the Office of the Chief Public Health Officer and the Workers' Safety and Compensation Commission. All schools are working to have their detailed plans submitted before the end of the current school year, and details of these will be made available to students, parents, guardians, and staff once those plans are reviewed and approved. In addition, ECE will be publishing a territorial plan on reopening schools for the 2020-2021 school year later this month. Mr. Speaker, the health and safety of residents and communities of the N.W.T is our primary concern. As we near the end of this school year, ECE remains committed to providing support to education leaders, students, parents, guardians, and teachers as we truly work together to meet public health and safety requirements while supporting the critical learning and well-being of N.W.T. students. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Thank you, Minister. Minister statements, Minister statements, Minister responsible for Justice.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. In the Northwest Territories, we entrust the RCMP with the responsibility to support every citizen's rights to safety and security, and we also entrust them with the right to take away a citizen's liberty in response to unlawful activity. That is a tremendous power and responsibility. We are fortunate to have the service of a professional and experienced national police force and an RCMP division dedicated to community policing. But it remains critically important that we ensure our policing services reflect the unique context of our territory and the diversity of our people, and respect the trust that we are all placing in them every day. The ultimate goal we are all working towards together should be safe communities where our citizens can thrive. The Minister's policing priorities for 2020-2021 have been under development since April, and they were already in their final form when the ongoing challenges of systemic racism within law enforcement took center stage around the globe. As we are all acutely aware, the world has changed drastically over the past few months. While it may initially have been a global pandemic that illustrated the need for out-of-the-box thinking as it pertains to our justice and policing systems, it has been society's recent awakening to the reality of racial injustice that has driven this home. It has become apparent that innovation and reform are necessary in these systems and that the status quo is no longer acceptable. We considered not presenting these priorities today through this statement, but decided we cannot shy away from painful reality of racism and a potentially difficult conversation about policing. So I will proceed to present the policing priorities today, and I look forward to engaging in more conversations with the RCMP and with the members. For 2020-2021, the 4 themes of policing priorities are: first, promote confidence in policing services; second, adapt to changing enforcement and community policing landscapes; third, continue to improve the RCMP's response to vulnerable population; and last, operational and fiscal innovation. Regarding the first priority, the need to build confidence and trust in those who we have trusted with our safety is foundational. Confidence will come from trust. Trust requires a relationship and mutual respect. It is also something that must be constantly and consistently nurtured and protected. To serve communities effectively, it is critical to acknowledge, reflect, and learn from a past that has not always been characterized by mutual respect, and use those lessons to improve understanding, empathy, and cultural safety in how policing is done today. Some progress in establishing trust has been the creation of the Commanding Officer's Aboriginal Advisory. In addition, the Northwest Territories has an Aboriginal Policing Services Unit within G Division, and the Division's Commanding Officer has directed that new members to a community complete a personal biography to be presented to the community. They are required to attend a cultural orientation specific to the community where they've been placed, and that includes meeting with local Indigenous organizations and elders. Such steps should be recognized, but that does not mean the work is done, and so promoting confidence in policing remains a priority. Northwest Territories communities have made it very clear how much they witness in their communities harm from alcohol abuse, drug trafficking, and bootlegging. Bootlegging and substance abuse have been identified on almost every community's community policing plan. In addition to further cracking down on illegal alcohol and drug trafficking, we've also identified the need for more effective enforcement of impaired driving legislation as a means to keep communities and streets safe. The RCMP must continue to foster trust within communities to help residents feel more comfortable reporting illegal alcohol and drug trafficking and impaired driving, which will allow the RCMP to implement more effective crime prevention and enforcement strategies. Although we know that root causes underlying the misuse of alcohol lie in areas beyond the influence of police, their enforcement efforts are integral to this disruption of illegal networks taking advantage of people who are living with mental health and addictions. The Department of Justice and the RCMP are a first point of contact for the diversion of suitable matters to local restorative justice options, such as the community justice committees. Restorative justice practices and principles have long been linked to more positive outcomes for both offenders and victims. By increasing the use of more restorative practices, the RCMP will play a vital role in identifying matters for youth and adult diversion early in the justice system process. The second priority, adapting to a changing community landscape, is linked to the third, and this is improve the RCMP's response to vulnerable populations. The RCMP play a critical role acting as the first point of contact for many people experiencing family violence by informing victims of their rights and connecting those victims to community supports. Recognizing that family violence rates remain consistently high in the Northwest Territories, it is essential that RCMP members and victim services workers continue to collaborate so that victims' rights are recognized and respected. Mr. Speaker, I seek unanimous consent to conclude my statement. Thank you.
Thank you. The Minister seeking unanimous consent to conclude her statement. Are there any nays? There are no nays. You may conclude your statement.
Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, we also recognize the challenges victims face in reporting sexual assault. We look to the RCMP to continue working with stakeholders and partners, including the Department of Justice, to implement solutions that would ensure a thorough investigation of a complaint in each and every case. Implementing trauma-informed investigative tools remains a best practice of our police efforts, and in turn is an area of focus we've identified for the coming year. This lessens the impact of crime and trauma on victims and their families, while also aiding in healing and recovery. Proper training and accurate use of investigative tools go a long way to improving the quality of the response provided to survivors of violence. Our last remaining priority, and again with connection to the third, is operational and fiscal innovation. Mr. Speaker, the world is experiencing an unprecedented challenge with COVID-19 pandemic. Policing is a critical piece of our emergency planning. The RCMP should continue careful planning to support safe communities and the safety of their members throughout this evolving situation. They should continue to participate in emergency planning within their scope at the territorial and federal level and collaborate wherever possible with territorial departments and agencies to help keep Northwest Territories residents safe. As we continue to work through the added challenges we face as a result of the pandemic, as well as addressing racism within law enforcement, it is more incumbent than ever on the Government of the Northwest Territories and the RCMP to work collaboratively to leverage our efforts for the benefit of our communities. And while this might require ingenuity, I am confident that we have appropriate and rigorous checks and balances that will hold our organizations accountable to operate innovatively within the financial limits of our contract. In closing, Mr. Speaker, I reiterate that the annual ministerial police priorities are part of a much wider conversation that includes acknowledging both the past and present that still needs much healing. It is about building trust and finding a way forward so that police services are partners in upholding and protecting the safety of all people. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Thank you, Minister. Member statements. Member for Hay-River South.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I would like to congratulate each of those students who are graduating from École Boreale, Diamond Jeunesse Secondary School, and Aurora College. I know that these graduates will not forget the year they graduated, nor will they forget the unique events of COVID-19 surrounding their graduation. Mr. Speaker, we all appreciate and acknowledge the commitment, sacrifice, and hard work these students put in to achieve their success as graduates. These students started their educational journey as young children and have now finished as young adults. That chapter has now closed, and it's time to take that next step, whether it be to further their education, join the workforce, or travel. It is only the beginning of life's journey. Mr. Speaker, the only advice I would have for each student is listen to others, show respect for others, and most importantly, follow your dreams. Mr. Speaker, I, along with a member of Hay-River North, am proud to announce the 2020 Grade 12 graduates from École Boreale. Megan Bueller, Regan Junkind, Justin Murray, Victoria Tweedy Petre. Mr. Speaker, I, along with the member from Hay-River North, am proud to announce the 2020 grade 12 graduates from Diamond Jeunesse Secondary School. Trey Beck, Brad Belanger, Shyla Boyce, Caleb Brockway, Jared Chocolate, Geronimo Constant, Sierra Flaherty McKay, Elisha Gill, Nicole Griffiths, Connor Hoffman, Alan Jensen, Hunter Lafferty, Tarek Leahy Chico, Lane Leonard, Dylan McWinney, Tennille Patterson, Angus Smith, Bryce Smith, Julie Squires Rowe, Zoe Walsh, Daniel Hoviak Kolahuk. Mr. Speaker, I, along with a member of Hay River North, am proud to announce the 2020 Hay River graduates from Aurora College. Fredel Denois, who received a Business Administration diploma, and Dana Webster, who received a Bachelor of Science degree in nursing. Mr. Speaker, for the graduates to achieve the success each celebrates today, we must recognize the parents, caregivers, family, and those teachers who supported and encouraged them to succeed. One day each graduate will look back and understand the importance of what they achieved and hopefully convey the importance to their children and others. Mr. Speaker, in closing, I congratulate all the 2020 Hay River graduates and wish them all the success for the future. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Thank you, member for Hay River South. Member statements. Member for Tuna de Welde.
Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, today I want to speak about our most important resource in the N.W.T. You might be thinking, yeah, we got diamonds, which are valuable. We got gold, yes. And let us not forget the oil and gas industry. But that's not what I'm referring to today. Mr. Speaker, the most important resource I'm speaking about is our youth. Our youth are our future. Without them, the work we're doing right now will be for nothing. It has been said it takes a village to raise a child. And I firmly believe that we must put as much support as possible from all of us to teach our children and give them a strong foundation as possible to prepare them for adult life. Because let's face it, some of these students will be sitting here one day in our chairs. So, Mr. Speaker, unfortunately to COVID-19, high school graduates everywhere had to endure unique and unusual challenges in their final year of high school. However, and I'm speaking to the students now, I know this experience will make you stronger and wiser as you continue on your journey. So with that, Mr. Speaker, today I would like to celebrate and honor all the high school graduates in the constituency of Tuna de Welde. I've reached out to the principals in each school, and their names include Tamara Enzo Dag from Lutz-Lacquet, Kiana Horsey from Lutz-Lacquet, Leanne Lockhart from Lutz-Lacquet, Greg Villeneuve from Denis Coin, Aaron Flunky Matla from Keleme Denny School, Killen Crapeau, Detta, St. Pat's High School, Darian Erasmus, Dilo, Sir John, Ethan Black, also Sir John. Lastly, Mr. Speaker, I'd like to end on a quote with a really good book that I'll plan to give to the graduates. It's called The ABCs of Adulthood. And here's an excerpt from this book. Risk. Nothing ventured, nothing gained. It has been around since Geoffrey Chaucer. And just because it's becoming cliche, it doesn't mean that it's still true today as it was in those times. In just about every realm of your life, love and work in particular, you must take risks. Yes, you might speak your love out loud and might not have it reciprocated, or you might try to cure cancer and fail. You might go on 50 dates that suck. But kids, you cannot reach the summit of Mount Everest until you've stumbled over a whole mountainside of rocks and ice. And Mr. Speaker, I want to thank all the teachers, principals and staff for helping these kids move along their journey. And I want to finish off and saying, we're all very proud of you, and we wish them all the very best in their future endeavors. Mr. Speaker.
Thank you, member for Tuna de Welde. Member statements. Member for Mumfway.
Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, did they get
but in Clinton region, there will be some of them had graduated. There were quite a number of people that had graduated in my community, and they'll be on their way to. And also the post-secondary, there are quite a number of students that have graduated for post-secondary education. I'm very thankful for that.
School grads and also the post-secondary grads, class of 2020. We are very proud of their accomplishments. especially during the whole COVID pandemic crisis. You've set a long goal, a lifelong goal, and achieve your dream. Well done. And Mr. Speaker, I have 3 of my own kids graduating this year. I must say I'm a very proud father standing before you to highlight some of their achievements. Mr. Speaker, my youngest daughter, Dene Maude Lafferty, graduated from St. Pat's High School, grade 12, and looking forward to continuing her education dream of one day working with kids, possibly in a pediatric area. Mr. Speaker, my second daughter, Sahara Sadeh Lafferty, completed her post-secondary diploma in the outdoor education program in Pembroke, Ontario. She is preparing to further her education in kinesiology degree this fall. And Mr. Speaker, last but not least, my oldest son, Jade Edzo Lafferty, completed his Red Seal Adjournment ticket in electrician. Mr. Speaker, as you can see, I am proud of my children and all N.W.T graduates for these amazing accomplishments, and I encourage them to continue on their educational and professional journeys, whatever that might be. Once again, congratulations to class of 2020. God bless. Masi.
Thank you, member for Mumpuy. Member statements. Member statements. Member for Inuvik Twin Lakes.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, the Dempster Highway plays an important role for Inuvik, and in fact, it's the lifeline to the Beaufort Delta. Over the years, we've seen many upgrades and improvements to the Dempster, and most of the hazardous sections have been corrected or widened. Mr. Speaker, you are aware that the widening of the highway usually consists of 4 kilometers per year and started at the N.W.T border and is working its way north to Inuvik. Mr. Speaker, residents in my community also use the Dempster Highway from Inuvik south to access fishing, camping, recreation sites south of Inuvik and around close proximity to my community. Mr. Speaker, the 50 kilometers south of Inuvik are used not only by Inuvik residents, but now residents coming in from Tuk. We've seen them come in and come camping as well, and head out to places like the Gwich'in Territorial Park. On this section of road, Mr. Speaker, we've had many accidents on certain corners of the Dempster Highway just outside of Inuvik. Mr. Speaker, at our current rate of widening the Dempster from just one end, Inuvik won't see some of the last remaining hazardous sections widened just outside Inuvik for at least 30 years. Mr. Speaker, Inuvik residents also deserve to have this section outside of Inuvik widened as well and not have to wait 30 years to reach us. Today I'll have questions for the Minister of Infrastructure regarding widening the road south of Inuvik. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Thank you, member for Inuvik Twin Lakes. Member statements. Member statements. Member for Frame Lake.
Merci, Monsieur le Président. I'd like to provide an update on the state of the Bathurst caribou herd since we last sat in March. March 13th, 2020, the Waikiki Renewable Resources Board decided that the proposed 2020 wolf cull could proceed as a pilot project. The board will conduct a more rigorous review of the remaining 4 years of the proposed program beginning in August of this year. This revised proposal should also include lessons learned from the implementation of the 2020 management actions. The board said that, quote, "It is clear that communication in advance of submission of wildlife management proposals needs to be improved. Future submission of wildlife management proposals should not leave the board in a position where it must choose the best of 2 bad options. The board encourages early and frequent communication amongst our respective staffs with respect to both proposed wildlife management actions and process and timelines," end of quote. Aerial shooting of wolves was to start in mid-April and run through until mid-May, and I'll have questions for the Minister later today. On April 3rd, the Minister of Environment and Natural Resources issued a joint news release with Indigenous leaders condemning the illegal harvest of 80 Bathurst caribou and wasted meat from 12 more animals. ENR officers seized meat and issued tickets to hunters that were caught. On May 6th, we were informed that ENR is postponing the Bathurst and Blue Nose East calving ground photo surveys planned for June 2020 until next year as a result of the pandemic. So, Mr. Speaker, it's wildlife that are also suffering. The frequency of these surveys was recently changed from every 3 to 2 years due to the precarious state of the herds. Wolf harvest incentives did not seem to work. Legal harvesting, caribou harvesting appears to have increased, and one of our key tools to assess the health of the herds has been delayed for a year. All of this is sad and bad news for the Bathurst caribou herd at a time our government continues to push ahead with a road that will cause irreversible harm. I'll have questions later today for the Minister of Environment and Natural Resources about details of some of these developments and when we can expect to see a comprehensive and balanced approach to the Bathurst caribou emergency that includes habitat protection. Merci, Mr. Speaker.
Thank you, Member for Frame Lake. Member statements. Member for Thabacha.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, in my reply to the Commissioner's opening address, I mentioned my support of the N.W.T. Métis Land Resource and Self-Government Agreement, as they are my constituents. Mr. Speaker, the parties of this agreement include the N.W.T. Métis Nation, which represents the Fort Smith, Hay River and Fort Resolution Métis Councils, along with the Government of Canada and the Government of the Northwest Territories. In 1996, these parties agreed to have negotiations take place in 2 phases. As of January 29, 2015, the N.W.T. Métis Nation Agreement in Principle was signed, which officially began Phase 2 of negotiations. Phase 2 will address self-government and the move towards a final agreement. Mr. Speaker, as MLA for Thabacha, I consider it a priority of mine to support the N.W.T. Métis Nation in advancing their claim into the final stages of its implementation. As MLA, I will do my best to work with the territorial government and help advocate for the N.W.T. Métis Nation as they continue to negotiate. Moreover, Mr. Speaker, there is one aspect of these ongoing negotiations that I'd like to comment on. Over the years, in talking with various Métis leaders, I've heard numerous times of people describing the territorial negotiating team as a very difficult team to work with, particularly after devolution came into effect on April 1st, 2014. I'm told that the territorial negotiating team became so more adversarial rather than conciliatory than before devolution. Also, the chief negotiator of the federal government is no better. It seems that both the federal and territorial chief negotiators always hide behind the excuse of having no mandate, thus the inability to say yes or no for a decision or anything at the negotiating table. Because these negotiations are always stalled and nothing gets done. This has got to change. Mr. Speaker, during the life of the 19th Assembly, I would like to see the Land, Resource and Self-Government Agreement make good headway with positive outcomes for the N.W.T. Métis Nation. Mr. Speaker, I seek unanimous consent for my statement.
Thank you. Member for Thabacha. The member is seeking unanimous consent to conclude her statement. Are there any nays? There are no nays. You may conclude your statement.
I urge our government, along with the federal government, to negotiate this agreement fairly and in good faith, as both those parties carry a fiduciary responsibility to do so. Also, Mr. Speaker, I'd like to congratulate the class of the P.W. Kaiser High School graduates of 2020. Your graduation is going to go down as unique because of the pandemic. It will also make each and every one of you stronger. Your journey is just beginning. Thank you again to all the educators who made this possible, the parents, and the larger community of Fort Smith. Mr. Speaker, I'd also like to thank my colleagues of the 19th Assembly, all the staff who work here for making my job easier, bearable, and enjoyable. I am grateful, and I wish they all have a great summer. I would also like to thank my constituents of Thabacha for their continued support, and I look forward to the caucus retreat in Fort Smith. I know that all the peoples of Fort Smith, including the N.W.T. Métis Nation, The Salt River First Nation and the town of Fort Smith will welcome our caucus retreat with open arms. I know my constituents will be great hosts. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Thank you, Member for Thabacha. Member statements. Member for Yellowknife Centre.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, there's been an unexpected silver lining resulting from the pandemic lockdown, and that's a significant decrease in greenhouse gas emissions. Flying, commuting, power generation, and industrial production have all fallen dramatically. A study in the journal Nature estimates global emissions have decreased by 17% and in Canada by 20%. That reduction puts Canada almost halfway to meeting its Paris Accord targets that will hold global warming at 1.5 degrees. But, Mr. Speaker, experts warn this change is likely going to be short-lived. When work and travel resume, greenhouse gas emissions will go right back up. In fact, they may climb even higher than they were pre-lockdown. That's been the pattern after other economic slowdowns. But what if this time is different? Mr. Speaker, we have a historic opportunity to restart our economy with the reduction of greenhouse gas emissions front and centre. The sudden transition from fossil fuels has shown us what's possible. Industry, government, and individuals must now investigate how to prolong and entrench these reductions. One place to start is to continue to replace diesel with renewable energy. N.W.T has done some good work in this area already by installing biomass heat in public buildings. We've also invested in solar and wind power pilot projects and replaced old diesel generators with more efficient variable speed models. Mr. Speaker, the next logical step is to invest in building retrofits. A report from Ecology North, released in April last year, makes the case for building a northern retrofit economy. The authors estimate an impressive 9% return on investments on retrofits over 10 years because of reduced utility costs. That means a reduction in the cost of living, a move every northerner would welcome. But that's not all. Investment in a retrofit economy, where people install better insulation and windows, for example, would create 123 jobs and add $15 million to the GDP of the Northwest Territories over the next 10 years. Mr. Speaker, these gains are modest, but the effects are far-reaching. Mr. Speaker, I seek unanimous consent to conclude my statement. Thank you.
Thank you, Member for Yellowknife Centre. The member seeking unanimous consent to conclude her statement. Are there any nays? There are no nays. You may conclude your statement.
Thank you, colleagues. Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The authors of the paper suggest we could begin this retrofit work right now by scaling up programs offered by organizations like the Arctic Energy Alliance. What we need to kickstart the process is an investment in rebates that will encourage homeowners to make these upgrades sooner rather than later. If not now, then when? Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Thank you, Member for Yellowknife Centre. Member statements. Member for Kamloops.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I've heard the class of 2020 referred to as the chosen ones. We've all seen the cartoon that takes us month by month through 2020, including threats of World War III, murder hornets, and the very real and world-changing COVID-19. I'm not sure what it means to be a chosen one in the wake of the craziness that has been 2020 so far. But I do know this: the grads of 2020 have had to overcome some significant hurdles to complete their schooling during the upheaval of a pandemic. Throughout history, there have always been events of significant change that have marked time, and most change events bring human suffering. We often hear people say, when bad things happen, look for the good. There are always good people. While COVID-19 has brought with it human suffering around the world, we haven't had to look long or hard for the good. The good has been loud. The good has been visible, and the grads of 2020 have been part of that good. They give me hope for a future where divisiveness and racism are replaced by civility and kindness, and where we are united by our common humanity. The grads of 2020 will not let us down. They have shown us that they are able to face uncertainty and roll with the punches. They have shown determination to deal with what life has put in front of them and to keep going. They have arrived at this huge life milestone resilient and ready to take on tomorrow, and we are proud, Mr. Speaker.
The grads of 2020 are globally united as the pandemic class. The whole world is watching and cheering them on as they step into their future resilient, driven, passionate, and also hopeful. As they step into their future, Mr. Speaker, the class of 2020 stands in a global battle against a worldwide pandemic, climate change, racism, and massive income disparities. They stand at a fork in the road that challenges unity and strength of character and which demands advocating for the greater good. To each of our graduates, I want to encourage you to enter the world with an open mind and a caring heart. Be compassionate, help find ways to serve others, not run away from them, help to unite, not divide, help to build, not tear down, help support, not demean. If you do you, you'll find your own path to fulfillment and happiness, and in doing so, your example will inspire the rest. Lend your unique voice and talents to your community. Find a path that allows you to be fulfilled while uplifting others at the same time. It is hard to stand up against the flow of the masses and be brave through kindness, but it is possible. It feels good, and good breeds good. In the class of 2020, you are oh so good. Good doesn't mean you have to do what people expect of you. Good means you have integrity. Good means you know your truth, and your truth inspires those around you to share their own honest selves. So, as you begin to find your way in this world, know that you have the power and presence to drive change. You are the greater good, and you have within you the power to change this world for the better. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Thank you, Member for Cam Lake. Member statements. Member statements. Member for Satu.
Good morning, Mr. Speaker. Today I would like to recognize the accomplishments of the graduation class of 2020 in the Satu region. With a total of 5 communities in the Satu region and 19 graduate students, it's a remarkable accomplishment in these unusual circumstances. Facing and adjusting to the change due to COVID-19, the students of the Satu region have displayed resilience, leadership, and working towards their educational dreams, and leading into the future to strive for higher accomplishments, leading to achieve their dreams. Your life, your journey has begun. It is a celebration. Congratulations. I am proud of you. The need for education in the Satu region is, we have a lot of projects that we are working towards. We need the educational opportunities and dreams and training within our region. I would like to commend the class of 2020 to continue their educational dreams, to strive as a Satu region, to lead with resilience. Congratulations, class of 2020. Merci.
Thank you, Member for Satu. Member statements. Member statements. Member for Yellowknife North.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. One of this Assembly's mandate items is to establish a managed alcohol program and a medical detox program by the spring of 2023. We expect such programming will reduce hospitalizations due to alcohol by 30%. Mr. Speaker, this is one of my favorite mandate items. I believe it shows a switch in mentality that this government is ready to put harm reduction at the core of our programs. There was much debate about managed alcohol programs in the last Assembly, but there was little progress on it. Mr. Speaker, during COVID-19, we saw a number of our service providers take the initial steps to build managed alcohol programs. I think this was largely due to a recognition that people detoxing in the midst of a pandemic and putting a surge in our healthcare system was not necessary, and it was a way to reduce harm. Many of these programs were not managed alcohol programs per se with the necessary medical supervision. They're a recognition that people going through an alcohol withdrawal is an extremely painful process. And Mr. Speaker, I believe we spend too much time in this Assembly debating how to provide alcohol and debating all of these issues around alcohol and not enough time focusing on helping our constituents heal. Mr. Speaker, alcohol is not the cause of addiction, trauma is, and we owe it in this Assembly to provide people the means to heal. And that can look different for every single person, Mr. Speaker. My dream is that when a person is struggling with alcohol, they show up to their service provider and they are given an option for on-the-land treatment, for medical detox, for a managed alcohol program. If they want to go cold turkey down south, they are given that option. They are given a wide range of tools to use because everyone's path to sobriety looks different. And we as government owe it to provide them programming that is non-judgmental and tailored to their needs. Mr. Speaker, I will have questions for the Minister of Health and Social Services to see that we are on track to providing such programming, and we can get this work done as soon as possible. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Thank you, member for Yellowknife North. Member statements. Member statements. Member for Nahende.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, COVID-19 has thrown us a curve in our celebrations of the class of 2020 graduation in Nahende. I've been informed these graduations ceremonies have been postponed to allow the celebration plans to be approved by the Chief Public Health Officer. I look forward to be part of those celebrations later on in the year. However, the DEAs and school staff and communities members have placed signage in the streets, set up a web page, developed family photos, given out a cooler package, and a number of other opportunities to celebrate with our successful grads. In Nahende, we celebrate various classes, starting out with kindergarten, grade 6, grade 9, and grade 12 across the region. I wish I had all the successful grads' names here today to celebrate with them, but unfortunately I can't get them. But I do know we have 5 post-secondary grads who will help the residents of the Northwest Territories in the future. We have 5 grade 12 graduates from the Echo Denny School in Fort Liard, 13 grads from the Litico Regional High School from across the region, from the smaller centres, and Fort Simpson. Like everyone here, I am so proud of these students. They have achieved so much, and I'm looking forward to seeing what they are going to achieve in the future. I'd like to thank the parents, teachers, support staff, families, friends, and for all their support and continued support for our grads. Mr. Speaker, I'd like to thank them very much, and I look forward to success in their future. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Thank you, member for Nahende. Member statements. Member statements. Returns to oral questions. Returns to oral questions. Recognition of visitors in the gallery. Recognition of visitors in the gallery. Acknowledgements. Acknowledgements. Oral questions. Oral questions. Member for Yellowknife Centre.
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, my first set of questions are for the Minister of Industry, Tourism and Investment. The Minister announced the creation of a Business Advisory Council almost 3 months ago, and when questioned in the House on May the 27th, she said, "We definitely commit to having an open and transparent and collaborative government with respect to telling us the details of the Business Advisory Council." So with that in mind, it's my understanding that the Council has met at least once. Can the Minister now tell us who's on the Council? Thank you very much.
Thank you, member for Yellowknife Centre. Minister responsible for Industry, Tourism and Investment.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I believe that information has been provided to the members. If it hasn't, I will follow up to ensure that it has. We were allowing the Council to make their own press release, as they are arm's length from my office. As such, we'll ensure that that gets corrected if it hasn't been done so before now. Thank you.
Thank you, Minister. Oral questions. Member for Yellowknife Centre.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, the public doesn't know anything about this Council. They don't know who's on it, they don't know the terms of reference, they don't know that they've met or when they will meet again. So in the spirit of transparent and collaborative government, which you have committed yourself to, can you please make the public aware of the details of this Business Advisory Council today? Thank you.
Thank you, member for Yellowknife Centre. Minister responsible for ITI.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, the Business Advisory Council released a press release earlier this week. If the member hasn't seen it, I will forward it along. We do have a statement coming, and we will ensure that the list is included there. As mentioned, this is their council, not my council, to determine how they communicate to the public. That's what we're currently trying to figure out. The council has met once or twice actually now. They're very keen to get going, and we will be providing that information. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Thank you, Minister. Oral questions. Member for Yellowknife Centre.
Yeah, thank you. This news release is news to me. It's news to my colleagues on this side of the House. I haven't seen it reported in the media. So we still are left with a situation where the government has created a council for which we have no public information. I don't know where this news release is. Is it possible for you to tell us now who's on the council, what their mandate is, and when they're going to meet again? Thank you.
Thank you, member for Yellowknife Centre. Minister responsible for ITI.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, as mentioned, the Business Advisory Council put out their own press release. It did not come through my department. Therefore, I cannot say why the member has not seen it, but I will commit to sharing that with you. I will right now list off the council then. We have Paul Gruner, Detton Show Corporation. He is the co-chair. We have Jenny Bruce, president of the Northwest Territories Chambers. She is a co-chair. We have Kyle Wright, Tim Sire, Pat Rowe, Linda Martin, Sean Crowell, Denny Rogers, Duck Trin, James Thorburn, Sarah Brown, Gary Vivian, Daryl Bolio, Harold Grinday, Donnelly DeMarc, Trevor Weaver, Kevin Hodgins, and I apologize if I've said anybody's name wrong, and we will provide the rest of the information to you in a written format, as it's probably just not worth the time to go through it right now. Thank you.
Thank you, Minister. I know there's a lot of passion here, but please direct your questions through me. Member for Yellowknife Centre.
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Speaker. My apologies. Thank you to the Minister for that information. The point is not that the information should be provided privately to me or to my colleagues, but that this council that was put into being by the government should be made known to the public. This council wouldn't exist without the government, so the government has a responsibility to tell the public what this council is about, who's on it. You've just mentioned some names, and what their mandate is. I'm sure you appreciate that there's a lot of interest in this council. There is some potential for them to make creative recommendations, like the ones that I mentioned in my statement about building a retrofit economy. So will the minister commit to making the information public today? Thank you.
Thank you, Member for Yellowknife Centre. Minister responsible for ITI.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. As mentioned, the press release from the Business Advisory Council does state their mandate and all of the members that are there. So again, I will forward that to the members. The council has met for literally 1 week. So while delayed, and I understand that's created frustrations for people, it is going. Part of that first week of discussions is to determine how the communications protocol will happen. As mentioned, it's not my council to dictate how they operate. So it's my apologies again if the member did not see the press release, but I cannot control what the media reports on. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Thank you, Minister. Oral questions. Oral questions. Member for Frame Lake.
Merci, Monsieur le Président. While we've been sitting here, I think one of the pieces of the best news I've had is in the 19th Assembly arrived in my inbox, and I want to commend the Premier for the leadership on this issue and her cabinet. We just got a news release about a permanent land withdrawal for the subsurface on the Adege protected area, which is supposed to be a... Thank you. And thanks to the Premier and cabinet. This is a very significant move in terms of reconciliation, so I sincerely want to thank my cabinet colleagues and the Premier in particular for the leadership on this issue. But my question, Mr. Speaker, is can the Premier provide the House and the public with an update about the permanent land withdrawal order for Adege, because it doesn't contain an end date anymore? Merci, Mr. Speaker.
Thank you, Member for Frame Lake. Honourable Premier.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I want to start by thanking the honourable member as well, the MLA, for recognizing the hard work that this cabinet has done for this. We committed to trying to foster better relationships, and we're working hard at that. So the reason it doesn't have an end date on it is because the Decho First Nations asked us for that. There were several requests from them and the Environment and Climate Change Canada to implement an interim land withdrawal to achieve permanent protection of the subsurface land associated with the Adege Candidate National Wildlife Area. So we understand that renewing the withdrawal without an expiry date, the Decho First Nation will be in a better position to secure funding to support future management in this of the Adege Park. So again, it was something that was asked, it was something that we all agreed to, and the next step in that is the land use planning. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Thank you, Honourable Premier. Oral questions. Member for Frame Lake.
Merci, Monsieur le Président. Thanks very much to the Premier for that. According to the Government of Canada webpage, it says that there's to be, that Adege will be established as a national park area under the Canada Wildlife Act in 2020. That's this year. So I think the permanent withdrawal is helpful, but what we really need is a transfer of the lands back to the federal government, or perhaps some other arrangement to prevent this from being undone in the future. So can the Premier tell us whether we're still on schedule for the establishment of Adege as a national wildlife area, and what role this government intends to play? Merci, Mr. Speaker.
Thank you, member for Frame Lake. Honourable Premier.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The Environment and Climate Change Canada will begin the consultation process to establish it as a national wildlife area. However, due to COVID-19 and the amount of work that the federal government is doing, there might be a little delay with that, although we are trying to get this moved forward as fast as possible. They know it's important to all of us, so we've stressed that as we go forward. So hopefully, we're currently in, the N.W.T is currently in decisions with the Deschaux First Nations and is interested in playing a role in the management of the park as we go forward. So, like I said, we're at the table, we're all working together. Canada is interested in moving this forward, the Deschaux First Nations and the GNWT. But this is a very successful achievement that we've made so early in our government. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Thank you, Honourable Premier. Oral questions. Member for Frame Lake.
Merci, Monsieur le Président. I want to thank the Premier again. So I just would like to get a better understanding of why the establishment of Adege is a contingent upon the Deschaux land use plan. Merci, Mr. Speaker.
Thank you, member for Frame Lake. Honourable Premier.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. So what I can say is that when I first became the Premier and the Minister of Indigenous Affairs, I flew in and met, back in those days we could actually fly, and had a meeting with the Grand Chief and her council and talked about it. And at that point I had realized that this park was taken off the table as kind of a negotiating thing, was my understanding. I didn't feel that was fair. So they asked me to put it back on, and I agreed. I feel that it's important. If we're going to build a relationship, Mr. Speaker, we need to be willing to give something. And at that point, I said, yes, we will work with you. And then in future talks, they agreed to work with us on a land use plan. So it's the start of a positive relationship. It is time for change. Everyone is saying that, and we're doing our best. We will have arguments. It's not going to be easy, but we are doing our best to work to settle all of the outstanding issues between the GNWT and the Indigenous governments. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Premier, final supplementary. Member for Frame Lake.
Merci, Monsieur le Président. I want to thank the Premier again. I think this is a very significant step forward. But part of my concern here is that the Deschaux land use plan has been in development for 19, count them, 19 years. And at first the obstacle was the federal government because they own the land and G&WT was at the table, but now the obstacle is our government. We own the land and our government is the obstacle. And I've heard this from people involved in the process. So, you know, if the concern is too much land being protected and so on, you got to give the communities the right to decide what they're going to do with that land. And eventually, if they want it to use for different purposes, that's their decision to make. So I want to, my question to the Premier is, can you tell us why this has taken 19 years to get the Deschaux land use plan to the point it is, and will our government get out of the way and finally approve this plan so that we can move forward? Thanks, Mr. Speaker.
Thank you, member for Frame Lake. Honourable Premier.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I can't say why it's taken 19 years. That wasn't my file before, and I certainly haven't been in this House for 19 years, and I don't want to make assumptions. What I do know is that when I assumed this portfolio, I was told by the Deschaux First Nations that there were issues with the relationship. And so we're trying to mend those relationships. It would be easy for me, Mr. Speaker, to say I will stand back and let you do what you want. However, there is a public interest as well, and the Deschaux First Nations recognize that. So we're going into this as partners in this, and we will do our best to make sure that this is dealt with in the committed 3 years. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Thank you, Honourable Premier. Oral questions. Oral questions. Member for Nuvik-Twin Lakes.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. My question is for the Minister of Infrastructure. Would the Minister commit to looking into whether it is possible to adjust the Dempster Highway widening plans to include starting the widening on the Inuvik side? Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Thank you. Minister responsible for infrastructure.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, the Department of Infrastructure has recently been considering this approach based on conversations with community members. I recognize that the highway, due to its proximity to Inuvik and associated recreational areas, is one of the most heavily traveled areas of Highway 8. I do have lots of conversation with my counterpart in the Yukon, who is also very keen to see the Dempster rehabilitated, and we have discussed that with the federal government. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Thank you, Minister. Oral questions. Member for Nuvik-Twin Lakes.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Would the Minister commit to widening the Dempster Highway from Inuvik this year? Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Thank you, Member for Nuvik-Twin Lakes. Minister responsible for infrastructure.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, infrastructure has approved $4.5 million in the 2020-21 capital plan for Highway 8 reconstruction using federal funding under the Building Canada Plan Bundle Number 3 for ongoing highway and widening and ongoing Highway 8 widening and rehabilitation. Planned work for this year includes 3.3 kilometres of embankment widening, brushing, culvert and guardrail installation for kilometres 146.6 to 149.6. The Building Canada Plan Fund started in 2019-2020 and is a $4.5 million per year for the next 5 years. I will commit to having the department examine our plans for this summer and beyond to align the work with the needs of the region. I cannot commit to that this will happen this construction season, as we'll have to look into timing, planning and permitting issues, but I would be pleased to update you on our review and share our plans moving forward. I would also like to mention that the Department of Infrastructure, through a combination of its own forces and contracted services, operates and maintains close to 2,500 kilometres of all-weather road and constructs over 1,400 kilometres of winter roads annually. We do this through the use of a 20-year strategic plan that addresses our transportation needs to ensure the safety of all Northwest Territories residents. So I'd have to go in and look at that plan and whether there needs to be adjustments, but thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Thank you, Minister. Oral questions. Member for Nuvik-Twin Lakes.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Well, since she won't commit to it this year, would she commit to separating and starting from both ends this year? Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Thank you, Member for Nuvik-Twin Lakes. Minister responsible for infrastructure.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I will commit to having a look at this and trying to incorporate the members' wishes. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Thank you, Minister. Oral questions. Member for Nuvik-Twin Lakes.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Will the minister commit that she will continue to fight for more money so that our highway can be done from the Inuvik to Sigachik, as it, you know, we have the nurse that goes out there. Sometimes we have RCMP, we have medical buses that travel down that road. We need more money and we need to have that road done before 30 years. So can the minister commit that she's going to go out and look for more money to get working on this highway, starting on Inuvik side? Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Twin Lakes Minister responsible for infrastructure.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I think anyone that knows me knows that I speak my mind, and I do so at my federal table. So yes, I commit to the member that I will continue to advocate strongly for the Dempster fix-up rehabilitation and with the federal government. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Thank you, Minister. Oral questions. Member for Mumford.
Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker,
Mr. Speaker, about this road to the new road to YELLOWKNIFE. ITI Minister, I'd like to ask questions.
I have additional questions for Minister of Infrastructure. Some questions may be for more detailed info, which the Minister may not have at hand, but this is coming directly from my constituents, so it's their words, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, what is the current status on the Clinchon All-Season Road project, more specifically to the northern, southern, and Clinchon hires. Last time I asked the minister, southern hires were 50% plus, Mr. Speaker.
Thank you, Member for Mumphrey. Minister responsible for infrastructure.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, as of June 2nd, 2020, 77 people were employed with the project. Of the 77 workers employed, 24 were from the Clecho region or the Northwest Territories, and 53 were from the South. There have been 6,573 hours of Clecho citizen training resulting out of the project to date. The number of employees is anticipated to increase up to 120 by the end of June. We remain committed to ensuring that local and northern benefits on the project are maintained. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Thank you, Minister. Oral questions. Member for Mumphrey.
Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I'm glad the minister is committed to monitoring the progress that's happening there. That's my next line of questions here. Mr. Speaker, we are fortunate to be living in the north, small enough that we run into our constituents or people that actually work at the Taser site, Clinchon All-Season Road. I was yet again, Mr. Speaker, informed by one of the current workers yesterday that southern hires keep increasing and friends or relatives from southerners get on heavy equipment faster than my own Clinchon people working there. Even those guys, my Clinchon workers, are waiting for a number of weeks now. Mr. Speaker, I have a question to the minister. What is the number of recent southern hires, new hires, the positions that they were hired for, and also advancement at the Taser construction site? Southern hires, Mr. Speaker. Mussey.
Thank you, Member for Mumphrey. Minister responsible for infrastructure.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I will have to come back to the member with those details. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Thank you, Minister. Oral questions. Member for Mumphrey.
Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I'd like to thank the Minister for her follow-up on this, because again, this is coming from constituents, so there are more detailed questions being asked of me to the Minister. So, Mr. Speaker, my Clinchon workers, which is approximately, as Minister indicated, 24 out of 70, or according to the workers there, it's around 100, and or coming to 100. And so it's a small number that we have there. And they're with years of experience as heavy equipment operators through the diamond mines experience, but are not given the same treatment as southerners wishing to advance. Mr. Speaker, could I have a minister's commitment to provide in detail, as she may not have at hand as indicated earlier, the number of Clinchon workers at site, any advancements since the start of construction, October 2019, in addition, southern workers at site, list of advancement. Mr. Speaker, Mussey.
Thank you, Member for Mumphrey. Minister responsible for infrastructure.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, yes, I will have to come back to the member with those details. However, I do want to commit to the member that I remain committed to ensuring that Northerners are getting meaningful work and training out of these projects, and we will ensure that we're going forward, that we're making sure that the training components are built in and that people are getting meaningful employment. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Thank you, Minister. Final short supplementary. Member for Mumphrey.
Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I understand the Minister is new to the file. I'm glad she's going to follow through. The agreement was before she came on board, so I'm glad she's going to be monitoring this. Mr. Speaker, the last question I have is, can I get a commitment from the Minister if she or her senior staff, departmental staff, visit the Clinchon All-Season Road construction site and meet with the Clinchon workers to simply hear them out and follow through with their concerns? Mr. Speaker, Mussey.
Thank you, Member for Mumphrey. Minister responsible for infrastructure.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, yes. Yesterday in the House, I committed to coming to speak with the workers at the EDSO maintenance camp for the highway. At the same time, I will come to the Taser camp and speak with people there. Anytime, though, I do encourage the member, if he does have constituents that have concerns, that they come to me directly and don't wait on those visits, which will likely be the last week of June. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Thank you, Minister. Oral questions. Member for Haver South.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I have questions for the Minister of Housing. Yesterday I brought up questions about lack of housing in Hay River. Since then I've been thinking about it and becoming increasingly frustrated and angry, and only wrote the questions while sitting here. I will start in Hay River. I'm going to start recommending to those residents that cannot find permanent housing to start looking at other communities, as government we just can't deliver the housing they require. So my first question to the minister would be, I would ask the minister, considering we have a significant housing shortage in Hay River, is her department willing to work with ECE to cover the cost of relocation and some temporary rent payment supports for those persons and families willing to relocate to Yellowknife or Southern Canada, as this appears to be the only option this government has to give our residents a chance for the housing they deserve. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Thank you, member for Hay River South. Minister responsible for Northwest Territories Housing Corporation.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and thank you, member, for your comment. The Northwest Territories Housing Corporation has right now, as I mentioned yesterday, had rolled out $43 million in infrastructure projects and housing throughout the Northwest Territories. And I understand the member's frustration with the lack of housing or homelessness issues throughout his riding. It has become quite significant throughout the Northwest Territories that we do have a large number of homelessness issues throughout the Northwest Territories. But the Housing Corporation does have programs that do accommodate these unique situations. We do have a homelessness assistance fund that is available to every resident throughout the Northwest Territories that does provide assistance for the first month's rent and the damage deposit for each client. We do we have made changes to our transitional rent supplementary program for the Northwest Territories. As of right now, we are working with a vulnerable working group in Hay River right now, and looking at strategies and options for Hay River for this area. As we progress and go forward, I will keep the member in up to date on what we will be creating for his riding. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Thank you, Minister. Oral questions. Member for Hay River South.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, it's not only a housing deficit we are facing in Hay River, there's access to land as well. Can the minister commit to work collaboratively with MACA Lands in the town of Hay River to ensure lands for public housing will be made available with a quick turnaround? Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Thank you, member for Hay River South. Minister responsible for housing.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Yes, I am aware that we do have to work with our Indigenous groups. There is a consultation period that we do have to fulfill when accessing land throughout the Northwest Territories. There are several in different jurisdictions and different approaches and different Indigenous groups that we would need to consult with. The department has been working in conjunction with the Department of Lands as we develop throughout the Northwest Territories. That is a relationship that has already existed, and yes, I will be working, continue that relationship, working with the Department of Lands for accessing properties, and also working with the Department of Education to look at our homelessness fund and financial assistance that we might that we have available to the residents of the Northwest Territories. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Thank you, Minister. Oral questions. Member for Hay River South.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, over the years, communities and government have been talking about smaller homes for people. So I'll ask the minister, will she commit her department to seriously look at construction of smaller homes for those that are homeless or hard to house? Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Thank you, member for Hay River South. Minister responsible for housing.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Yes, that is a conversation that we are actually having right now. We do have a program called the Community Initiative Fund that works directly with the community residents, with the leadership, and looking at unique projects such as this. And yes, I do commit to working with my department, and I will follow up with the member on the progress of it, and also with the outcome of the Vulnerable Persons Working Group in Hay River as well too. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Thank you, Minister. Final supplementary, member for Hay River South.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. We have lots of conversation, and that's kind of part of the problem. What we need is more action. But To address the housing deficit in the N.W.T, it always comes down to money. What action has the minister taken to address the issue of lack of funding to substantially address our housing shortage here in the N.W.T? Is the minister applying any pressure on the federal government to access additional funds for housing? Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Thank you, member for Haver South. Minister responsible for housing.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Yes, the Housing Corporation is in constant communication with the Canada Mortgage and Housing Corporation. I have established a working relationship with my federal counterpart. We do have access to the $60 million co-investment fund for the Northwest Territories, and it's a partnership and an initiative that we are working through within our department. We are establishing staff right now to roll out this project, this funding, so it could be easier, accessible to the residents of the Northwest Territories. And as we go forward, I still continue the conversation with the federal government and to lobby for money for the Northwest Territories. We do live in a unique territory. We do have unique challenges here, and our construction season, I also display that it's short. So going forward, I will commit to working with our federal government and accessing more money for the Northwest Territories. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Thank you, Minister. Oral questions. Member for Yellowknife North.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. As I mentioned earlier, I'm very happy to see the mandate item to establish managed alcohol programs and a medical detox program. During the COVID-19 response, we saw a number of kind of organic beginnings of a managed alcohol program. The Disabilities Council provided a number of the people quarantining with daily alcohol. In addition to Aspen apartments, when people were isolating, were provided with alcohol. My question for the Minister of Health and Social Services, is there any intention to grow these programs into a proper medical managed alcohol program? Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Thank you, member for Yellowknife North. Minister responsible for Health and Social Services.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, the establishment of a managed alcohol program is a commitment of this, the mandate of this Assembly. Research into what a managed alcohol program could look like in Northwest Territories is something our department has done a fair bit of work at. The COVID-19 pandemic has pushed our department to move towards a managed alcohol program more quickly than anticipated in order to keep people safe and support the public health orders. Controlled access to alcohol is currently being provided as part of the COVID-19 response for homelessness individuals. So this is to help people stay isolated when necessary to reduce the chance of withdrawals. Alcohol is being provided, again, like the member said, to Aspen, the former Arnica Inn, and the Inuvik Warming and Isolation Center. So yes, our department has done a fair bit of work, and it is something that we could easily look at going forward. Thank you.
Thank you, Minister. Oral questions. Member for Yellowknife North.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I'm very happy to hear that. The other half of this mandate commitment is a medical detox center. Right now, our emergency center gets overwhelmed with people due to alcohol-related issues, and the commitment in this government is to reduce those by 30%, a very admirable commitment. One of the issues right now is we're sending people to emerge to deal with alcoholism, and there's not always beds for them to detox. They're not always treated as they should be. So my question for the Minister of Health is, when can we expect to see the medical detox program established? Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Thank you, member for Yellowknife North. Minister responsible for Health and Social Services.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, going forward, using insights that we have gained from this COVID experience, we have been able to work with partners to make this type of harm reduction program a permanent part of addiction services here in the Northwest Territories. However, it's a little too early to say what this would look like or commit to anything definite timeline, but we can see the importance of these programs. And because of this, we will prioritize planning to ensure that this is available ongoing. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Thank you, Minister. Oral questions. Member for Yellowknife North.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I'm always happy to hear that we have this was in the mandate spring of 2023, which I thought was a little too long, and I'm always happy to hear that we're actually beating a mandate commitment. So I want to commend the department and the minister for all the work and the pressure that COVID has kind of put on this. I guess one of my issues is that the programming we are offering right now is kind of linked to people isolating due to COVID, and I understand that. But when a constituent comes to me and asks what kind of detox programs are available, what kind of addictions counseling are available, that I want to know when I will be able to refer them to a managed alcohol program. So I guess my question to the Minister is, when can we expect programming to exist that I could actually refer a person to? It's not simply because of COVID-19. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Thank you, Member for Yellowknife North. Minister responsible for Health and Social Services.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I just want to go put this in perspective and just to let people know that we are serious about this, and this is a big issue. You know, we referenced earlier about the CAPE report, and you know, the Northwest Territories is a little low in some of the indicators, but I want to say that we've received some funding and we hired a senior advisor. So this person will be tasked in leading the coordination and addressing the problematic substance abuse here in the Northwest Territories. So this is something that we're hiring staff. Now we receive funding, we're hiring staff, and this is not just a health responsibility, it's a whole government approach. It's homelessness, it's justice, just to name a few. So it is a whole government approach, and you know, this is a good move in terms of dealing with this in Northwest Territories. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Thank you, Minister. Final short supplementary, Member for Yellowknife North.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. My final question is that there's a number of kind of programming going on right now, and I don't think we're quite where we want to be, and I understand that we're working towards that. But can I get a sense from the Minister of whether this programming is ultimately intended to be run by an NGO, a non-profit organization, or whether we are anticipating as government to be running the managed health programs? Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Thank you, Member for Yellowknife North. Minister responsible for Health and Social Services.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, right now we're in a process of hiring staff. We've got a whole of a government departments working together. And, you know, here in the Northwest Territories, we always reach out to partnerships, and, you know, we work together. It's not just a N.W.T problem. It's substance abuse and alcohol abuse, and here in the Northwest Territories, it's a whole of a government approach. So, you know, this is something we can look at. I mean, it is important, and we recognize that. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Thank you, Minister. Oral questions. Oral questions. Member for Yellowknife Centre.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, my questions are for the Minister of Health and Social Services. Today, we anticipate that the Territory will move into Phase 2 of the Emerging Wisely Plan, and that will enable a greater degree of freedom for N.W.T residents and a greater range of economic activity to resume. My question is, in what circumstances would we have to return to Phase 1 or even to lockdown? Thank you.
Thank you, Member for Yellowknife Centre. Minister responsible for Health and Social Services.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, as part of the public health risk assessment framework that's included in the Emerging Wisely plan, the Chief Public Health Officer has publicly stated that we might take what might take a community or the Northwest Territories back a phase or back into containment is the most restrictive phase right now. So we fully expect a second wave to come anywhere from August to November this year. The second wave in Canada could force the Northwest Territories to go back phases if travel restrictions are not strongly implemented. Resources for checkpoints, Protect Northwest Territories, compliance and enforcement are all important to ensure that we have proper implementation. Depending on the severity of the second wave hitting Canada and perhaps the Northwest Territories, that our testing capability, we may need to revert back to relaxing Phase 1 or containment properly to protect the public health and also the residents here in the Northwest Territories. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Thank you, Minister. Oral questions. Member for Yellowknife Centre.
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Speaker, and thank you to the Minister for that response. I'm looking for more specific information. So how many cases would force us to reverse Phase 2 or Phase 1? And is there any consideration about where those cases would be located to drive this decision? Thank you.
Thank you, Member for Yellowknife Centre. Minister responsible for Health and Social Services.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, at this time, we're not sure. It is all depends on our Chief Public Health Officer and some of the orders. So, you know, we've talked about some of the measures that we're doing now, and you know, we need to make sure that our enforcement, our Protect Northwest Territories, some of the measures we have in place that are continue to be strong, and it's important to recognize that our Chief Public Health Officer has the authority to make any changes to the orders. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Thank you, Minister. Oral questions. Member for Yellowknife Centre.
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Speaker. Thanks again to the Minister. I'm going to continue to ask this question because I think people need to understand whether it's a matter of having a case, 10 cases, 100 cases, and also whether it matters in the decision-making, whether those cases are in Yellowknife or whether they are in one of the small communities. I think that people want some accountability about when the phases could be reversed. What would trigger that in the N.W.T. rather than in the country as a whole? Thank you.
Thank you, Member for Yellowknife Centre. Minister responsible for Health and Social Services.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, 3 o'clock today we're doing a media release, and we're talking about what Phase 2 will look like. And our Chief Public Health Officer, our Deputy Minister for Enforcement, Premier, and myself will be talking about what opening up Phase 2 will look like. But I think here's an opportunity for a question to our Chief Public Health Officer to ask her at what point do we revert back and how many cases it would mean. Right now, Mr. Speaker, I just don't have that information. Thank you.
Thank you, Minister. Oral questions. Member for Yellowknife Centre.
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Speaker. Thank you to the Minister for that. I find the answer a little troubling because we don't have the opportunity to question the Chief Public Health Officer in public, but we are holding the Executive Council responsible for the management of the pandemic, and they're, of course, taking advice from the Chief Public Health Officer. So where is the accountability? Where does the accountability lie on the decision to move backwards through the Emerging Wisely plan? And how is Executive Council involved in that decision making? Thank you.
Thank you, Member for Yellowknife Centre. Minister responsible for Health and Social Services.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I signed the order, so which means our Chief Public Health Officer has the authority to take control of this pandemic. And in terms of where we stand as a cabinet, we get updates from our Chief Public Health Officer. She briefs us as cabinet, and in that level of detail, Mr. Speaker, that was asked, I don't have that with me. However, I can commit to getting back to the member with the number of cases. And yeah, thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Thank you, Minister. Oral questions. Member for Kamloops.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, in March I asked the Minister of Justice who the lead department is within the N.W.T. for domestic violence. The N.W.T. has the second highest rate of domestic violence in the entire country. At the time, the N.W.T. did not have a lead department for domestic violence, and I advised the House that I would come back around to the question by the end of the sitting. Unfortunately, our sitting was cut short, so here I am today. And so I'd like to ask the Premier, the Honourable Premier, which department is the lead department responsible for domestic violence for the Government of the Northwest Territories? Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Thank you, Member for Kamloops. Honourable Premier.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Domestic violence is not okay, and it affects many, many people in the Northwest Territories and throughout Canada, but the member is right. We're the second highest rates, and we do need to do something about it. It's not as easy. There's no one answer to domestic violence is the issue. So we did talk about our cabinet table. Things that we need to look at include our criminal justice response. It talks about treatment. We need to talk about housing for people. we need to talk about, treatment for people that are the perpetrators and people that are the victims. So it goes across all departments. And as such, then, we decided as a cabinet table that it would make sense that the lead department would be the Executive Indigenous Affairs. I would be the lead. However, in saying that, it's very important to know that we all have a responsibility. All of my cabinet members and all members and all of society have an obligation to speak out and try to address the horrible things that are seen when we talk about domestic violence. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Thank you, Honourable Premier. Oral questions. Member for Kamloops.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker, and I appreciate that Cabinet sat down and had this conversation and came up with a response, so thank you to them for that. What I would like to know from the Honourable Premier is if she would commit to creating a meaningful domestic and interpartner violence prevention awareness campaign during the life of this Assembly. Thank you.
Thank you, Member for Kamloops. Madam Premier.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. It would be irresponsible not to do a thorough public awareness campaign, Mr. Speaker, for too many years. The perception when I grew up as a child, the theory was you made your bed, you lie in it. Days were different back then, and many women experienced that and had to live with that because they were shamed if they did disclose and they decided to leave their partners. Those times are done. Mr. Speaker, it is time for all of us to have a voice and speak out against it. So absolutely, Mr. Speaker, I will commit to having an aggressive campaign to actually get it out there in the public and have people talking about it. If we do not talk about it, Mr. Speaker, we will not address it. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Thank you, Honourable Premier. Oral questions. Member for Kamloops.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker, and I agree, and I appreciate the Premier's commitment to this. My third question for the Premier is when someone disappears, the first hours are the most crucial. Mr. Speaker, there's rarely evidence a crime has been committed. However, this is a prerequisite for police to be able to seek a court's permission for a search warrant, for personal records, for somebody who has gone missing. What I would like to know from the Premier today is, would the N.W.T commit to bringing forward a missing persons legislation in the life of this Assembly? There's precedents set by other jurisdictions, by other provinces and territories, and this could serve as a model for the Northwest Territories. So would the Premier commit to bringing this forward for our Legislative Assembly? Thank you.
Thank you, Member for Kamloops. Honourable Premier.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I think we're all committed to it, but for the specifics of that answer, I'd like to transfer it to the Minister of Justice. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Thank you, Honourable Premier. Minister of Justice.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, this issue dates all the way back to 2012. It was originally raised at federal, provincial, territorial tables, and sadly here we are in 2020, and of course the Northwest Territories does not yet have this legislation. Some provinces have moved ahead with their own, but it is not uniform across the country, but we can't be left behind. So yes, Mr. Speaker, we are going to do the work that is needed to get ourselves ready, to do the investigative work, to put the proposal together. It is my hope that it would be ready to go this Assembly, but seeing as how I am just today, turning my mind to it, I'm not quite prepared to say the timeline to it, but I'll make sure we have a timeline possibly before I'm back in the Assembly, so we have a sense of whether that'll be possible, and at the very least we're going to get it started. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Thank you, Minister. Final supplementary, Member for Kamloops.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker, and I appreciate the collaborative response from both the Premier and the Minister of Justice on that one. Mr. Speaker, yesterday we spoke in the House about if you fail to plan, you plan to fail. And so my last question for the Premier today in regards to domestic and interpartner violence is, would the Premier commit to creating a N.W.T action plan to address domestic violence and interpartner violence throughout the life of this Assembly? Thank you.
Thank you, Member for Kamloops. Honourable Premier.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. So, like I said, that we brought it up at the Cabinet table. We've decided the lead. We've already put it on our Committee of Cabinet agenda. We'll have a working group. We will be looking forward to that. At this point, I don't want to commit to an action plan. I want to make sure that we know what we're doing before. I do believe that if you don't plan, you plan to fail. However, Mr. Speaker, I also believe that sometimes the N.W.T does way too many plans and they sit on shelves and get dusty. So I want to make sure that this work is a priority for this government. It's a priority for Indigenous women and girls throughout the Northwest Territories. Domestic violence has to be a priority for all people in the Northwest Territories. So I won't commit to an action plan. I will commit to action. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Thank you, Honourable Premier. Oral questions. Member for Frame Lake.
Monsieur le Président, my questions are for the Minister of Environment and Natural Resources on the Bathurst caribou emergency. Predator control can be a useful tool in recovery of the herd, but I'd like to know from the Minister if he could tell us about the success of the wolf harvest incentive and the aerial shooting program, especially whether the targets were actually reached. Merci, Mr. Speaker.
Thank you, Member for Frame Lake. Minister responsible for Environment and Natural Resources.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, ENR and Clecho government submitted a proposal for a joint wolf management program to help support the recovery of Bathurst and Blue Northeast herd. The Wekwaji Renewable Resource supported a pilot project this winter, and fieldwork wrapped up mid-May. While we face a number of challenges related to COVID and bad weather, we were able to complete a range of actions to support caribou recovery. Mr. Speaker, these actions include training and incentives for wolf harvesters as part of the traditional economy, putting out 11 satellite collars to monitor wolf movement, and the aerial move of 41 wolves from the herd winter range. Given its low numbers and the challenges we face this year, we focused mostly of our efforts on the Bathurst herd. Mr. Speaker, because information is still coming in from wolf harvesters and analysis are still underway, final results for the pilot project will not be available until August, and at that time we will present that information. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Thank you, Minister. Oral questions. Member for Frame Lake.
Merci, Monsieur le Président. I want to thank the Minister for that. It was good to see the Minister working with Indigenous leaders to condemn the illegal killing of caribou and meat wastage in March of this year. Can the Minister tell us what enforcement actions resulted from this hunting and what preventative measures this government is taking? Merci, Mr. Speaker.
Thank you, Member for Frame Lake. Minister responsible for ENR.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, this was a very disturbing result that we've seen this past winter here. So I'm actually going to take a bit of time to read out the whole response here, because I think it's very important that the public hears and understands what we're doing. ENR actively monitors the mobile Bathurst Caribou Management Zone, or mobile zone, throughout the winter 2019-2020 harvest season. The monitoring includes checkpoints at McKay Lake and Gordon Lake and regular ground and aerial patrols. Given an increase in harvesting on the winter road, ENR increased its presence and monitoring activities. In late March, renewable officers determined that more than 80 caribou were illegally killed in the mobile zone, and wasted meat from 12 more caribou were found outside the zone. ENR officials conducted field investigations which resulted in 8 ongoing investigations. Because they are active legal investigations, I cannot provide any further detail at this time on those 8 cases. In response to the illegal harvesting, I worked with the Clecho Grand Chief George McKenzie, Let's Denny First Nations Chief Darryl Marlowe, and other Indigenous regional leaders to issue a joint statement. In this statement, we enforce the need for responsible harvesting of caribou in this time of rapid herd decline. The government will continue to work closely with its co-management partners to implement a range of measures to support the Bathurst, including implementation of the mobile zone. Mr. Speaker, I have to thank the staff of ENR. They worked really, really hard on the mobile zone, even in difficult times. And I will have to say I was very disappointed to hear some of the stuff that they had to go through. But we are working with our co-management partners to address this. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Thank you, Minister. Oral questions. Member for Frame Lake.
Merci, Monsieur le Président. I want to thank the Minister for that detailed response, and I do commend his leadership in working with the Indigenous leaders on that issue. So, Mr. Speaker, as the Minister obviously knows, exploration and development in the range of the Bathurst Caribou Herd is probably at an all-time low, partly due to the pandemic. Now would seem to be a really good time to implement mobile caribou conservation measures that would provide temporary habitat protection. And this work is called for in the Cabinet-approved Bathurst Range Plan. So can the Minister tell us about the status of the promised mobile caribou conservation measures and when we can expect to see them fully implemented? Merci, Mr. Speaker.
Thank you, Member for Frame Lake. Minister responsible for ENR.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, the collaborative development of the Bathurst Caribou Range Plan provides guidance on activities to support the range of the Bathurst Caribou Herd, including mobile protective measures. ENR has developed a draft framework for implementing the mobile caribou conservation measures on the range of the Bathurst herd. This framework will provide a pilot project that has being done this year to test the approach and procedures for implementing mobile measures. A possible industry partner has been identified to work with ENR to pilot the mobile measures within the late summer and fall range of the Bathurst herds, and discussions are ongoing, and we will provide that information to SCEDI once we hear more information. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Thank you, Minister. Oral final supplementary, Member for Frame Lake.
Merci, Monsieur le Président. I want to thank the Minister for that. I've been pushing him on that for some time, so I look forward to getting the information. The scheduled calving ground surveys for the Bathurst caribou herd it's not going to proceed this summer as a result of the pandemic. Can the Minister tell us what the management implications are for the herd now that this key population assessment tool is not going to take place? Merci, Mr. Speaker.
Thank you, Member for Frame Lake. Minister responsible for ENR.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, again, some of the challenges that we're dealing with COVID. So ENR was unable to secure a research permit from Nunavut to proceed with the planning calving ground survey of the Bathurst and Blue Moose East herd. The survey will be rescheduled for June 2021, which will be 3 years since the last survey, and which is within our time frame that we do the survey. Other herd monitoring programs are able to continue, including composition surveys, monitoring radio-collared caribou, and other target research. Given the very low size of the Bathurst herd, ENR and its co-management partners are currently doing a wide range of actions to support herd recovery. Postponement of calving ground survey will not delay or impact current management actions, including harvest, habitat, and wolf management. And Mr. Speaker, I'd like to inform the House is that I've reached out to the Minister for ENR from Nunavut, and we've had some communications back and forth, and we were talking about having a phone call or a face-to-face meeting sometime later this summer so we can discuss this important activity. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Thank you, Minister. Oral questions. Oral questions. Member for Frame Lake.
Merci, Monsieur le Président. There's still some confusion about what happens when people from outside arrive into the Northwest Territories. There was a CBC report yesterday on their website, and I just want to quote one sentence here. It says, if they don't meet one of the essential services exemptions, they'll be told they need to apply for an exemption and self-isolate for 14 days. So I've got some questions for the Minister of Health on this, and I've talked to her about this and raised some of these concerns. So I'd like to know, Mr. Speaker, if non-Canadian citizens arrive into the Northwest Territories and they do not meet one of the current exemptions, will they be turned back? Must see, Mr. Speaker.
Thank you, Member for Frame Lake. Minister responsible for Health and Social Services.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. While we're talking about COVID, I need to take this opportunity to correct the record. Yesterday, in response to the honourable member from Yellowknife North, I stated that roughly 1/3 of the population suffered from chronic disease. I did not have the stats right in front of me, and I was working from memory, so it's my bad. In fact, Mr. Speaker, according to the Canadian Chronic Disease Surveillance System, more than 12,000 individuals, or about a quarter, not a third, about a quarter, of the population in the Northwest Territories are believed to have a chronic disease. Although not all chronic diseases are associated with increased risks of severe COVID-19 illness, with that, that's the response to the member's question yesterday. So thank you, Mr. Speaker. Now we'll get back to the other member's question. The Chief Public Health Officer's jurisdiction does not extend to public health officers being able to force people to turn back. Any persons, whether you are a Canadian citizen or not, who presents at the border without approved documentation or without meeting any one of the exemptions under the travel restriction order will be told they can either wait at the border and submit a resident self-isolation plan for approval by contacting Protect Northwest Territories, a return to place of origin and submit a resident self-isolation plan for approval, or be charged $1,725 if they decide to proceed to travel in the Northwest Territories. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Thank you, Minister. I think that's what you call two birds with one stone there. Member for Frame Lake.
Merci, Monsieur le Président. I'd like to chat with the Minister afterwards. You have an opportunity to make a personal explanation to correct the record, but that's a procedural thing. This is still very confusing, Mr. Speaker. So what happens when a Canadian citizen arrives into the N.W.T. and they do not meet any of the current exemptions? Will they be turned back, or are they allowed to stay somewhere, even if it's at the border, or are they allowed to stay for 14 days and self-isolate and then apply for an exemption, or how does this work? Merci, Mr. Speaker.
Thank you, Member for Frame Lake. Minister responsible for Health and Social Services.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, any person, I'll say it again, any person, whether you are a Canadian citizen or not, who present at the border without approved documentation or without meeting one of the exemptions under the travel restrictions order will be told that either they can wait at the border, do the paperwork, return back to their place of origin, or be charged the fine. I don't know how clear this can be. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Thank you, Minister. Oral questions. Member for Frame Lake.
Merci, Monsieur le Président. So, there's still a little confused here. I know it's... presumably then somebody coming in, even if they're a Canadian citizen, non-Canadian citizen, can camp out at the airport for 14 days, and then they've cleared the self-isolation, and then they can travel anywhere in the Northwest Territories? Is that how this could work, Mr. Speaker? Thanks.
Thank you, Member for Frame Lake. Minister responsible for Health and Social Services.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, no, if a person travels into the Northwest Territories, you have to self-isolate in one of our 4 centres. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Thank you, Minister. Final supplementary. Member for Frame Lake.
Merci, Monsieur le Président. I'm still confused, and I think members of the public are still confused about this. So, if someone presents at the border, they don't have an exemption, they don't have a self-isolation plan, and if they head off somewhere, who's going to cover the costs associated with that? Merci, Mr. Speaker.
Thank you, Member for Frame Lake. Minister responsible for Health and Social Services.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, a Canadian who does not meet any exemptions is prohibited from traveling within the Northwest Territories. If a person who does not meet our exemption arrives and is directed to self-isolate before returning to their point of origin, they will need to pay for their self-isolation. Currently, the N.W.T. only pays for Northwest Territories residents who need to self-isolate in a self-isolation centre. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Thank you, Minister. Colleagues, our time for oral questions has expired. Written questions, returns to written questions. Replies to Commissioner's address. Replies to Commissioner's address. Petitions. Petitions. Reports of committees on the review of bills. Reports of committees on the review of bills. Reports of standing and special committees. Reports of standing and special committees. Tabling of documents. Minister responsible for Health and Social Services.
Mr. Speaker, I wish to table the following 4 documents. Accreditation report from Mcleacho Community Service Agency, a follow-up letter for oral questions 263-119, brackets 2, impacts of COVID-19 on long-term care facilities, home and community care report, and the N.W.T's response to the home and community care report. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Thank you, Minister. Tabling of documents. Minister of Finance.
And Mr. Speaker, I wish to table the following documents. Inter-activity transfers exceeding $250,000 April 1st, 2019 to March 31st, 2020. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Thank you, Minister. Tabling of documents. Minister responsible for Worker Safety Compensation Commission.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I wish to table the following document, Workers Advisor Office, Northwest Territories and Nunavut, 2019 Annual Report. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Thank you, Minister. Tabling of documents. Tabling of documents. Pursuant to section... Member for Yellowknife Centre.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I wish to table the document, The Northern Benefit Retrofit Economy, Ambitious, Achievable Building Sector Greenhouse Gas Emissions Reductions with Net Positive Returns, Improved Quality of Life and Job Creation by Ecology North. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Thank you, Member for Yellowknife Centre. Tabling of documents. Tabling of documents. Pursuant to Section 5 of the Indemnities, Allowances and Expense Regulations of the Legislative Assembly and Executive Council Act, I wish to table the summary of members' absences for the period February 5th to May 5th, 2020. Thank you. Tabling of documents. Tabling of documents. Notices of motion. Notices of motion. Motions. Member for Yellowknife North.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. This has been one of the longest sessions, I think, in legislative history, a very long budget session, and I'm happy to move the motion to bring it to an end today. I move, seconded by the Honourable Member for Hay River North, that notwithstanding Rule 4, when this House adjourns on Friday, June 12, 2020, it shall be adjourned until Thursday, October 15, 2020. And further, that any time prior to October 15, 2020, if the Speaker is satisfied, after consultation with the Executive Council and members of the Legislative Assembly, that the public interest requires that the House should meet at an earlier time during the adjournment, or at a time later than the scheduled resumption of the House, the Speaker may give notice, and thereupon the House shall meet at the time stated in such notice and shall transact its business as if it had been duly adjourned to that time. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Thank you, Member for Yellowknife North. Can you please clarify the seconder of the motion? Thank you.
The member for Hay River North, Mr. Speaker.
Thank you. Motion is in order. To the motion. Question has been called. All those in favor? All those opposed? Any abstentions? Motion is carried. Just for the member, we haven't had a taste of the 6 consecutive weeks of session, so please look forward to that. Okay. Notices of motion for the first reading of bills. Notices of motion for the first reading of bills. First reading of bills. First reading of bills. Second reading of bills. Second reading of bills. Consideration in Committee of the Whole of bills and other matters. Consideration in Committee of the Whole of bills and other matters. Report of Committee of the Whole. Report of Committee of the Whole. Third reading of bills. Third reading of bills. Minister of Justice.
The honourable member for the Sawtooth, that Bill 10, Temporary Variation of Statutory Time Periods, COVID-19 Pandemic Measures Act, be read for the third time. And Mr. Speaker, I request a recorded vote. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Thank you. The Minister, this motion is in order. To the motion, the question has been called. The Minister has requested a recorded vote. All those in favour, please rise.
The member for Yellowknife South, the member for Range Lake, the member for Great Slave, the member for Hay River South, the member for Tabacha, the member for Trinidad-Welladay, the member for Nahende, the member for Sawtooth, the member for Inuvik Boot Lake, the member for Hay River North, the member for Yellowknife Centre, the member for Frame Lake, the member for Cam Lake, the member for Decho, the member for Yellowknife North, the member for Montfouille, the member for Inuvik Twin Lakes.
All those opposed, please rise. All those abstaining, please rise. The results of the recorded vote, 17 in favor, 0 opposed, 0 abstention. The motion is carried. Bill 10 has had third reading. Members, before we adjourn today's sitting, I wish to say some final words. Our Assembly was one of the first in Canada to resume full operations with all members in attendance. Congratulations. Other legislatures have operated with minimum numbers of members. Political parties selected those who were allowed to attend. Our consensus government does not work that way. Although we may not always agree, consensus requires that each member be heard. In making it possible for us to attend, I want to acknowledge and thank Kim Wickens, the Deputy Clerk, members, Precinct Services, and her team. This includes Brian Thagert, the Sergeant at Arms, Derek Jericon, Deputy Sergeant at Arms, Michael Butt, Security Supervisor, and all the security team for their hard work, professionalism, and problem solving in coming up with a plan for us to all attend this sitting safely. Members, the months of isolation, stress, and trying to keep our residents informed during this pandemic took a toll on all of us. When we returned, this affected us all. I am proud of how members overcame challenges, moved forward, and got the important work of government done. I encourage all of you to reflect on what you have accomplished in the last 3 weeks. A full budget for the government was reviewed and passed. 2 supplementary operations were reviewed and passed. Bill 10 was passed to allow for adjournment of legislative timelines during the pandemic. Standing committees delivered 3 committee reports with 18 motions adopted, and the House adopted a motion calling for the Northwest Territories Seniors and Elder Strategy. Members, we would not have completed this work without the dedicated staff of the departments and Legislative Assembly who work hard both in the building and at home to support our efforts. Today, the Northwest Territories will enter Phase 2 of Emerging Wisely. As we look forward to the summer ahead, I encourage all members and residents to continue to practice safe hygiene practices and physical distancing. It is a time for us to all spend time with our friendship and family circles. Mr. Clerk, orders of the day.
Orders of the day for Thursday, October 15th, 2020, 1:30 p.m. Prayer, minister statements, member statements, returns to oral questions, recognition of visitors in the gallery, acknowledgements, oral questions, written Written questions, returns to written questions, replies to Commissioner's address, petitions, reports of committees on the review of bills, reports of standing and special committees, tabling of documents, notices of motion, motions, notices of motion for first reading of bills, second reading of bills, consideration in committee of the whole of bills and other matters, report of committee of the whole, third reading of bills, orders of the day.
Thank you, Mr. Clerk. This House stands adjourned until Thursday, October 15th, 2020 at 1:30 p.m.